A millionaire arrives home early after a strange premonition and cannot believe what his eyes show him. He finds the caregiver of his elderly mother confined to a wheelchair, laughing sadistically while soaking her with icy water from a hose in the middle of winter. Mateo Cruz gripped the leather steering wheel slightly. His knuckles, though carefully manicured, whitened for an instant. It wasn't the road except for the layer of virgin snow that was beginning to accumulate, was safe. It was the haste, an absurd visceral haste that had been born in his gut an hour ago, in the middle of a boring meeting with investors from Singapore. Out of nowhere, a stab of anxiety, a cold pinch at the base of his skull that had nothing to do with figures, mergers, or acquisitions. It had to do with her, with his mother, Isabel. He had left her that morning. As every day, wrapped in the cream-colored wool blanket he himself had brought her from Scotland, sitting in front of the living room window that faced the garden, her eyes still lucid, still capable of sparkling with a flash of her old character, had followed the snowflakes that were beginning to fall. "It's going to be a good snowfall, son," she had said with her voice broken by years and illness. He had leaned down, had kissed her forehead furrowed with blue veins and wrinkles that told stories of sacrifice, and had promised her, "I'll be back early, Mom. I'm not dining out tonight." And he had kept his word. He had interrupted the meeting with a vague excuse that he knew would cost him an apologetic phone call later, and had hit the road. Why? He didn't know. It was just a feeling, a shadow in his heart, that urged him to return home, to his fortress of glass and steel, to his bubble of success and control, built stone by stone, to protect the only person who had always believed in him. He turned onto the private road, flanked by tall cypresses whose branches bent under the weight of the snow. The tires crunched satisfyingly. The security gate opened with a soft automatic click. The house stood at the end of the road, a modern structure of clean lines and large windows, now tinted bluish-gray under the leaden sky. A warm light emanated from some windows, promising warmth and shelter. Everything seemed in order, perfect, motionless. He parked next to the main entrance, turned off the engine. The silence, after the purr of the powerful engine, was abrupt, only the creaking of the bodywork cooling and the soft whisper of falling snow. He breathed deeply. The haste, the absurd anxiety, began to dissipate. He felt a bit foolish. Of course everything was fine. Brenda, the caregiver, was the best, with impeccable references, a spotless record, and manners that inspired confidence. She had been with them for 6 months, and his mother seemed to like her, or at least tolerate her with quiet resignation. He opened the car door. The air hit him in the face, a blow of dry cold that cut his breath. He buttoned the top button of his cashmere coat and adjusted his gloves. His breath formed dense and ephemeral clouds. He walked toward the main door, his footsteps leaving deep and sharp tracks in the clean snow. He was going to ring the bell, out of habit, but stopped. He didn't want to disturb. Maybe his mother was sleeping. He took out his keys, looking for the polished titanium master key. It was then that the sound reached him. It wasn't a house sound. It wasn't the television, nor the radio, nor the hum of the heating. It was a sharp, strident sound that cut through the icy peace of the evening. A laugh, a female laugh, but not a laugh of joy or complicity. It was a hard, metallic laugh, charged with cruel satisfaction that froze the blood in Mateo's veins more than the winter wind. It was Brenda's laugh, but he had never heard her like that. It didn't sound human. He stood paralyzed, the key inches from the lock. His heart, which had calmed during the final stretch, began to hammer against his ribs with primitive and alarming force. Something was wrong. Something was deeply, horribly wrong. His instinct, the one he had ignored in the office, was now screaming at him with terrifying clarity. The laugh, cut off suddenly, followed by another sound, A pressurized water jet, clear, strong, like that of a hose. A hose, in the middle of January, with 10 degrees below zero, and a snowfall in progress. It was nonsense. Unless a shiver, completely foreign to the ambient cold, ran down his back. He didn't bother using the key. His hand, now trembling, searched for the knob. The main door wasn't locked, only the latch was thrown. That was strange. Brenda was extremely meticulous about security. He pushed the door slowly, silently. The warmth of the house enveloped him. But it was a heavy warmth, charged with a humid and strange smell of wet earth, of a bathed dog. The sound of water was clearer now, coming from the back patio, from the area of the covered pool and the winter garden, and along with the sound of water, a weak moan, barely audible, an animal whimper of deep agony. Matteo entered the vestibule, his expensive leather shoes leaving wet marks on the polished wood. The house was silent, too silent, as if holding its breath. The light was dim, only that of the standing lamps turned on, projecting long and distorted shadows. He advanced like a sleepwalker, each step amplified by the furious beating in his ears. His mind tried to find a rational explanation, a logical reason for that water sound, for that laugh, for that moan. But all the doors his reason opened led to the same dark room of panic. He reached the arch that separated the main living room from the corridor leading to the winter garden. The glass sliding door that led to the patio was ajar, and through the crack came a gust of icy air that contrasted brutally with the interior warmth. And from there, the sounds were clear, crystalline, horrible. The roar of the hose. Brenda's laugh. Again, a cackle of sadistic triumph. And a sound that broke his soul in two. A broken gasp, a choked hiccup, a weak and metallic struggle. The sound of wheelchair tires trying to move on wet slabs. No, he whispered to himself, a prayer, a denial. Please, no. With a slowness that seemed eternal, he approached the sliding door. The glass was fogged by the temperature difference, but through the condensation drops, the scene unfolded before his eyes like a nightmare in high definition. The winter garden was an enclosed space, with a glass roof through which you could see the snow falling, accumulating in the corners. The tropical plants, their green and lush leaves, seemed mute and horrified witnesses. In the center of the patio, in front of the covered and empty pool, was his mother. Isabel was hunched in her titanium wheelchair, the same one he had bought after months of research, to find the lightest, most comfortable, safest one. But now it wasn't a symbol of mobility or care. It was a cage. The straps he himself had installed to prevent her from slipping during transfers were buckled tight, immobilizing her against the backrest. Her small body, almost childlike, was soaked. Her fine white hair, always so carefully groomed, was stuck to her skull and face, dripping ice water. She wore the light blue flannel nightgown she liked, the one with penguins, now darkened and transparent from moisture, stuck to her paper skin. She trembled in a frightening way, convulsive, as if an electric current ran through her spine. Her teeth chattered with a dry and terrible noise that reached Matteo's ears like the sound of his world crumbling. And in front of her, with boots firmly planted on the flooded ground, stood Brenda. She wasn't the neat, easy smiling Brenda he knew. This Brenda had her face contorted in a grimace of pure enjoyment. Her cheeks were flushed, not from cold, but from excitement. In her hands, she firmly held the nozzle of a green hose, from which came a powerful and straight jet of ice water. The water hit directly on Isabel's chest, who shuddered with each impact, emitting that choked moan, that animal whimper he had heard from outside. "This is how you like it, isn't it, Isabel?" shouted Brenda, and her voice was a poisonous screech. "You love to cool off. An old woman like you needs to activate circulation. Come on, smile, have fun." And she laughed again, a laugh that resonated in the enclosed space, hitting the glass and returning like a perverse echo. Matteo didn't think. His body reacted on its own. A primordial rage, a pain so vast and deep it had no name, exploded inside him. He opened the door with a kick. The glass trembled in its frame. "What the fuck are you doing?" His voice wasn't a scream. It was a roar, an explosion of pure fury that seemed to make the air itself vibrate. Brenda turned around startled, and for a fraction of a second, the grimace of sadism on her face transformed into pure panic. The water jet deviated, wetting the slabs and plants. Isabel, in her chair, emitted a guttural sound, a sob of terror and relief at the same time as the direct torment ceased. Her eyes, wide open, flooded with panic and water, found her son's, and in them, Matteo didn't see only physical pain. He saw a humiliation so deep, a shame so heartbreaking, that it broke his soul. "Mr. Cruz," exclaimed Brenda, trying to compose herself, quickly lowering the hose as if trying to hide it. It's not what it seems. But Matteo was no longer listening to her. He had crossed the distance between them in 3 long strides. His gaze didn't leave his mother. From his mother's lips, bluish, trembling. From her hands, gripping the chair arms, fingers numb and blue. From the water running down her face and mixing with the silent tears that furrowed her cheeks. He knelt in front of her, in the puddle of ice water, not caring about the cold that soaked the fine fabric of his dress pants. His own hands, large and warm, trembled uncontrollably, with infinite gentleness, which contrasted brutally with the violence boiling inside him. He brushed the wet hair from his mother's forehead. "Mom," he whispered, and his voice broke on one word, turned into a thread of sound. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Isabel tried to speak. Her lips moved, forming silent words. Only a slight sound escaped them. A broken sigh that was a complete confession of pain. Brenda, recovering some of her arrogance, took a step forward. "Sir, you must understand. Your mother had an accident. She soiled herself. She was disgusting. I was just cleaning her. It's what you pay me to do. Clean up the filth." Matteo slowly raised his gaze. His look, charged with such intense hatred it could almost be touched, pierced Brenda. The woman stepped back, intimidated by the carnivorous silence emanating from him. "Cleaning her?" asked Matteo, and his voice was as cold as the water soaking his mother. "With ice water, at 10 below zero, terrorizing her, laughing?" "She doesn't understand," insisted Brenda, her voice rising in pitch, a note of hysteria showing. "She's just a crazy old woman. She doesn't even know where she is. She pees herself like a baby. Someone had to teach her." Matteo stood up. He didn't do it quickly, but with deliberate and threatening slowness. His height, his build, which he had always used in boardrooms to command respect, was now a weapon. He positioned himself between Brenda and his mother, a human wall. "Get out of my house," he said, with terrifying calm. "What? But you can't fire me like this. I have a contract." "Now," he roared. And this time the explosion was so powerful that Brenda let out a shriek and dropped the hose, which fell to the ground spitting water erratically. Fine. I'm leaving," she stammered, trying to dodge around him. "But you'll pay me until the end of the month, and I assure you that no one else will want to put up with this." She didn't finish the sentence. Matteo didn't hit her. He grabbed the coat that was hanging on a hanger by the door and threw it at her face. "Out, I don't want to see or hear you. If you haven't disappeared in 30 seconds, I call the police. And then I call all the elderly care agencies in this state. Let's see how long it takes you to find work." Brenda's face paled. The threat was clear and credible. Muttering curses under her breath, She hastily buttoned her coat and left, almost running through the main door, without looking back. The sound of the door slamming shut was like the period at the end of a nightmare. But the nightmare hadn't ended. It had only changed phases. Matteo immediately turned to his mother. The fury dissipated, replaced by desperate urgency. Isabel continued trembling uncontrollably. Her eyes were half closed. Her breathing was shallow and gasping. "Mom? Come on. We have to warm you up," he said, unbuckling with clumsy fingers the straps that immobilized her. The metal of the buckles was frozen. When he freed her, her body leaned forward. Without strength, he surrounded her with his arms, noticing how the cold of the wet nightgown penetrated the cashmere of his coat in an instant. He lifted her carefully. She was so light, so fragile, like a wounded bird. He noticed that her skin, through the damp fabric, was terribly cold. He carried her in his arms, like she was a child, toward the interior of the house. He left a trail of water in his wake. His mind, trained to solve multi-million-dollar crises, blocked for an instant, overwhelmed by panic. What to do? Where? How? He took her to the main bathroom. In the guest suite on the ground floor, the closest one. With one hand, he opened the shower and turned the faucets to maximum heat. Warm steam began to fill the environment. With utmost care, with a tenderness that tore him apart inside, he sat his mother on the marble stool and began to undress her. Her fingers, numb and blue, resisted. The nightgown was soaked and stuck to her skin. Each small tug, each movement, drew a weak moan from Isabel. "It's over, Mom. I'm here now. I've got you," he murmured over and over, a litany of comfort as much for her as for himself. Finally, he left her naked. Her body was a map of vulnerability, fragile bones, translucent skin furrowed with veins, and a constant violent tremor that seemed to come from deep within. He helped her get under the stream of hot water. Isabel screamed slightly at contact, at the brutal contrast between the cold that had invaded her and the heat that now hit her. Matteo knelt outside the shower, holding her, making sure she didn't slip, gently rubbing her arms, her back, trying to return warmth to her body with the contact of his hands. Little by little, the violent tremors gave way, transforming into chills. The bluish color of her lips and nails began to give way, replaced by a pale and sickly pink. Her breathing stopped being an anguished gasp to become a deep and tired sigh. Matteo closed his eyes, resting his forehead against the cold glass of the shower, fighting against the tears of rage and helplessness that finally threatened to flow. When he was sure she was stable, he took her out of the shower, wrapped her in a large and fluffy towel, and dried her with infinite meticulousness, as if any excessive pressure could break her. He dressed her in the thickest flannel pajamas he could find, and then wrapped her in 2 wool blankets, seating her on the living room sofa. In front of the gas fireplace he lit at maximum power. He prepared very hot tea with honey, and gave it to her to sip slowly, holding the cup with his hands, because hers still trembled too much. Isabel said nothing. She just looked at the fire, her eyes glassy, lost somewhere between shock and shame. The silence was dense, heavy, broken only by the crackling of artificial flames and the whisper of snow against the windows. Matteo sat beside her, taking one of her hands in his. It was still cold. He rubbed it gently. "Mom," he said, his voice hoarse with contained emotion. How long had she been doing this?" Isabel didn't answer at first. She continued looking at the fire. Then, a slight sob, barely a tremor of her shoulders, shook her. Finally, she turned her head and looked at him. Her eyes, so wise, so tired, were full of pain that went beyond the physical. "I didn't want to bother you, son," she whispered, and her voice was a thread of voice, an echo of what it was. "You were so busy. You have your life." The words fell on Matteo like concrete slabs. I didn't want to bother you. He who had everything, who controlled empires, who believed himself her protector, had been the last to find out, because she, in her infinite goodness and terrible vulnerability, had tried to protect him. Other times? He asked, and his throat was so tight he could barely articulate the words. Isabel lowered her gaze toward her wrinkled hands, intertwined with her son's strong and young ones. She nodded, almost imperceptibly. A tear, hot and salty, escaped from her eye and traveled down the wrinkle that marked her cheek. She didn't need to say more. The confirmation was a twisted dagger in the open wound of Matteo's chest. He stood up. Unable to stay still, the rage returned. But now it was a cold, calculating rage, directed at himself. How had he not seen it? How had he not suspected it? The times Brenda had mentioned difficult episodes, the times his mother had seemed quieter, more withdrawn than usual, the fear he sometimes saw in her eyes when Brenda approached, and he had attributed to age-related confusion. He had failed. He had failed, in the most catastrophic way possible. I'm going to call the doctor, he said, and his voice sounded flat, metallic. No. Isabel's voice was a little firmer. It's not necessary. I'm already better. Mom, you could have hypothermia, pneumonia. Matteo. She looked at him, and there was a flash of the strong woman she was, the one who raised him alone, who worked cleaning houses to pay for his university. No, please, no more. No more strangers. Not today. He understood. Humiliation was an open wound. The presence of a doctor, more questions, more looks, would be another kind of torture. He nodded, defeated. Okay. But at the slightest sign of fever, cough. Okay, she whispered, closing her eyes, exhausted. Matteo remained standing, looking at her, the woman who was everything, reduced to this, to a bundle of nerves and bones, terrorized by the person who was supposed to care for her, and he, the magnate, the problem solver, felt completely powerless. The sound of wind lashing the windows filled the silence. The house, once his refuge, his trophy, now seemed a sinister place, full of shadows and betrayal. He walked to the bar and poured himself a neat whiskey, his hand trembling. The amber liquid burned his throat, but he felt no warmth. Suddenly, a thought crossed his mind, like lightning. Brenda, her phone, her purse. She had left so quickly that she hadn't collected her things. Maybe there was something there, some proof, some explanation. He left the glass and climbed the stairs 2 at a time, heading to the room the caregiver used, a small but comfortable suite in the east wing of the house. The door was open. Inside, everything was impeccable, as if no one lived there. On the nightstand was her mobile phone, and in the closet, her purse. With a knot in his stomach, Matteo opened the purse. Inside, the wallet, some keys, some tissues, and a small hardcover notebook. Black, cheap. It didn't look like a work diary. He opened it. They weren't notes about his mother's health. They weren't medication reminders. They were sentences, loose paragraphs, written in tight and furious handwriting. Today the old woman looked at me wrong, like I was trash. I gave her her puree colder. She ate it crying. Good. He arrived today with a new coat. I'm sure it costs more than what he pays me in a month. He asked me to take care of his most precious thing. What irony. I'll take care of his precious treasure, in my own way. The new wheelchair is shit. I can barely move it. Today I left her in front of the window all afternoon. Let her see the world she can no longer touch. Matteo turned the pages, each one crueler, more deranged than the previous. His breathing became more and more shallow. It was the meticulous record of systematic torture, psychological and, as he had seen today, physical, a slow and enjoyed revenge for reasons that only existed in Brenda's sick mind. And then he came to the last entry. Today's. The ink still seemed fresh. It's snowing. He said he'd be back early. The old woman is especially weak today. She urinated at noon. I told her she was a disgusting pig. She cried. Today is hygiene lesson time. A cold shower. Very cold. Let's see if she learns that way. And let's see if he arrives just in time for the show. Maybe I'll record a video with my phone. A memory for the family. Matteo dropped the notebook as if it had burned him. He leaned against the wall, dizzy, nauseous. It wasn't just an act of punctual evil. It was a plan, a premeditated and enjoyed torture. And the mention of the phone. He grabbed Brenda's phone. It was locked with a password. With clumsy fingers, he typed today's date. Error. He tried his own birth date. Error. He tried his mother's. The screen unlocked. His stomach shrank. He opened the camera app, and then the gallery. There were videos, dozens of them, thumbnails showing his mother, in different places in the house, with expressions of fear, confusion, pain. Some were short, others longer. With his heart beating in his throat, he pressed the most recent one, the one with the timestamp from less than an hour ago. The image was stable, professional, as if the camera were resting on something. It focused on the winter garden. He saw Brenda framing the image, adjusting the frame to perfectly capture Isabel in her wheelchair. With the hose in hand, her laugh could be heard, that laugh that froze his blood from outside. "Smile for the camera, Isabel," said Brenda's voice, sweet and poisonous. "Your millionaire son will want to see how well I take care of you." And then the water jet, the impact on his mother's chest, the choked scream, the convulsion. The camera zoomed in, focusing on Isabel's face, contorted with pain and humiliation, tears mixing with the ice water. Brenda laughed behind the camera, enjoying the spectacle. The video lasted 3 minutes, 3 eternal minutes of torture. Matteo watched it all. He couldn't look away. Each scream from his mother was a spear in his heart. Each laugh from Brenda, a poison in his soul. When the video ended, he remained sitting on the floor of the room, leaning against the bed. The phone slipped from his hands. There were no tears, only an enormous void, a deep darkness. The discovery wasn't just the horror of what had happened. It was the dimension of evil. It was the record of his own failure. It was proof that his mother had been suffering in silence, day after day, while he was in his office, making money, believing that with contracts and checks he could buy her well-being. He stood up. He took the phone and notebook. He went down the stairs, each step heavy, as if he carried steel chains tied to his ankles. The heat from the fireplace didn't reach him. He felt an internal cold that nothing could warm. Isabel dozed on the sofa, exhausted, the blankets forming a nest around her. Her breathing was more regular, but still choppy. Matteo stopped to observe her, and the love he felt at that moment was as vast and painful as the rage burning in his veins. He approached and knelt again beside her, taking her hand. It was a little warmer. "Mom," he whispered. She opened her eyes, slowly. The initial panic, at feeling touched, dissipated upon recognizing him. An infinite sadness nested in her gaze. "Yes, son? I have to make a call," he said, choosing his words very carefully. "It's not the doctor. It's to make sure Brenda doesn't do this to anyone else. Can I tell someone what happened?" Isabel looked at him. And for a moment, the old dignity, the woman who had never complained, who had swallowed saliva and pride all her life, shone in her eyes. She nodded, with an almost imperceptible movement. "Yes," she whispered. So it doesn't happen to another daughter." The phrase destroyed him. Another daughter. She saw herself as a burden, but thought of others as daughters who should be protected. Mateo squeezed her hand tightly. Never again, Mom. I swear. Never again. He got up and headed to his study, the room from which he ran his empire. It was a space of order and control. Designer furniture, turned-off computer screens, shelves full of economics books that now seemed absurd, irrelevant to him. He sat in his leather chair, but didn't turn on the computer. He took his personal phone. He wasn't going to call the local police. Not yet. He dialed a memorized number, the one belonging to Robert Bobby Finnegan, his personal security chief and former FBI agent. Bobby was discreet, efficient, and didn't ask unnecessary questions. Above all, he was loyal. He owed Mateo more than a salary. He answered on the second ring. Boss. It's not office hours. Problems with the Singapore people? Bobby. Mateo's voice was harsh, charged with emotion he couldn't contain. I need you to come to the house. Now. On the other side of the line, Bobby's carefree tone changed instantly. Are you okay? Is Isabel okay? No. Mateo swallowed. She's not okay. Something happened. Something terrible, Bobby. An accident? Illness? Should I call an ambulance? No. It's not that. Mateo closed his eyes, seeing again the water jet hitting his mother's chest. It's the caregiver, Brenda. I caught her. Bobby, I caught her mistreating my mother, in the most cruel way. A heavy silence fell on the other side. Fuck, boss, Bobby finally said, his voice now grave and professional. Physically. Yes. And psychologically. And it's not the first time. I have evidence, videos, a diary. He heard the sound of keys on the other side. I'm leaving now. I'll be there in 10 minutes. Don't touch anything. Don't call anyone until I get there. Is she? She's safe. With me. She's traumatized. Keep her warm and calm. I'm coming. The call ended. Mateo left the phone on the desk. 10 minutes. It seemed like an eternity. He returned to the living room. Isabel was still awake, looking at the fire. Bobby is coming, he said, sitting beside her. He's going to help us fix this. She nodded, weakly. She didn't ask what fix meant. She trusted him, blindly. That trust, at that moment, weighed on him more than any $1,000,000 contract. The 10 minutes stretched like hours. Mateo couldn't stay still. He checked his mother's temperature, offered her more tea, arranged blankets that didn't need arranging. Every minute that passed, the image of the video replayed in his mind, in an endless loop, the laugh, the water, the fear in his mother's eyes. Finally, the soft doorbell sounded. Mateo straightened. Before he could move, the door opened with the key Bobby had for emergencies. Bobby Finnegan's footsteps echoed in the marble vestibule, firm and urgent, but muffled by the snow. He still carried on the soles of his tactical boots. He brought with him the cold from outside, a winter wake that mixed with the oppressive heat of the house. His figure, broad and encased in a black parka, was that of a man who had seen too much, but his face, normally a compendium of professional serenity, was tense. His eyes, clear and analytical, swept the room in seconds, capturing the details, the puddle of water drying near the garden door, the moisture on the sofa where Isabel huddled, Mateo's cadaverous pallor, the absolute stillness, broken only by the crackling of the fireplace. Boss. He nodded toward Mateo, his voice a low and calm rumble. Then his gaze settled on Isabel. His expression immediately softened, adopting a professional tenderness that wasn't feigned. Bobby was fond of the elderly woman. She reminded him of his own grandmother, now deceased. How are you, sweetheart? Isabel tried a weak smile, failed, which became a slight movement of lips. Her eyes, swollen and red, filled with tears again, upon seeing a familiar face that didn't represent a threat. She raised a trembling hand from within the blankets. Bobby approached without haste, knelt in front of her with surprising agility for his build, and took that cold hand between his, large and call-used. "It's over," he murmured, with a conviction he wanted to make real. "You're safe." Matteo observed the scene, his throat tight. Seeing his mother's vulnerability in another's hands, even someone trustworthy, provoked a mixture of relief and renewed impotent rage. "Bobby," he intervened, his voice broken. "We need to talk, in the study." Bobby nodded, gave a gentle squeeze to Isabel's hand and stood up. "Do you need anything else, Isabel? Water? Another blanket?" She shook her head, closing her eyes. Exhausted, she just wanted the invisibility of sleep to cover her. The two men headed to the study. Bobby closed the door behind him. The room, once a sanctuary of control, now seemed an isolation cell. "Where is she?" Bobby asked immediately, getting to the point. "She left. I threw her out. About, I don't know, 20-30 minutes ago. She took her coat and left on foot." Matteo ran a hand over his face. I have this." With clumsy movements, almost as if the objects burned him, he handed over Brenda's phone and the black notebook. Bobby took them without a word. First he leafed through the notebook. His eyes, those eyes that had read reports of atrocious crimes, darkened with each page. His jaw tightened, a muscle tensed in his cheek. He made no comment. Then he took the phone. Matteo gave him the password. Bobby opened the video gallery. He didn't watch them all. He just pressed the first and last ones. That was enough. The low sounds of the video, the laugh, the water, the choked gasp, filled the room for a few seconds before Bobby paused it with a brusque gesture. He raised his gaze to Matteo. In his eyes there was no longer professionalism. There was a cold and contained anger, that of a man who knew the darkest side of humanity and detested it with every fiber of his being. "Fuck Matteo," he cursed, and it was the first time he had called him by his first name in years. This is premeditation. It's torture. It's—" "I know," Matteo interrupted, turning away because he couldn't bear the compassion and fury he saw in the other's gaze. "I know, Bobby. And the worst is that it's been going on for months. And I didn't find out. I didn't see anything." "Don't start." Bobby's voice was sharp, but not cruel. "This isn't your fault. The fault belongs to a sick mind. Monsters are good at hiding their true face. It's what they do." He remained silent for a moment, processing. His mind was already working, tracing plans, evaluating options. "Okay, listen, this is what we do. We can't call the police yet, not like this." Matteo turned, surprised. "What? Why the hell not? I have evidence. You have the evidence in your hand." "Yes, I do," Bobby nodded, holding the phone and notebook as if they weighed tons. "And it's a bomb. But if we call now, a standard process begins. Brenda will be arrested, yes, but police will also come. Maybe an ambulance for Isabel. Questions, forms. Do you really want to subject your mother to that tonight? After what happened, they'll drag her to a hospital for an examination, interrogate her. It would be reliving the trauma. It would be cruel." Matteo collapsed into his chair. He hadn't thought of that. He had only thought of revenge, of immediate justice. Bobby was right. His mother wouldn't endure such a process right now. "So what? We let her escape?" he asked, his voice full of frustration. "No." Bobby's denial was categorical. A lash. "She doesn't escape. No one who does something like this escapes. But we do it intelligently. We do it right." Bobby began pacing around the room, his mind working at full speed. First, Isabel. She needs a trusted doctor, one who comes to the house, discreetly, who signs what needs to be signed, without asking questions. "I know one. I'll call him. He'll come. He'll examine her here, on the sofa if necessary. We need a medical report that documents the state of shock, possible hypothermia, trauma. That's fundamental evidence. Matteo nodded, feeling some control return to his hands. Agreed. Do it. Second, Brenda. Bobby stopped in front of the window, looking at the snowy night. She hasn't gone far. She's scared. She probably went to the nearest train or bus station to get out of the city, or maybe to a cheap motel to think, I have people, discreet people. They'll put a tag on her. They'll locate her and keep her under 24-hour surveillance. She won't be out of sight. When we decide to move, we'll know exactly where she is. And when do we decide to move? Matteo asked, fixing his gaze on Bobby's back. When we have everything tied up. Bobby turned around. When the doctor has examined Isabel, when I've made a forensic copy of all the content of this phone and this notebook, when I've contacted a prosecutor I have dealings with, to present the case impeccably, so there are no leaks, so the accusation is for premeditated assault, torture of a vulnerable person, let her rot in jail for decades. We don't want her to escape on a technicality, or negotiate a light sentence. We want the full weight of the law to fall on her. Matteo listened, and for the first time since he had opened that door, he felt the ground stop moving under his feet. Bobby had a plan. It was cold, calculating, and perfect. Third, Bobby continued, and his voice lowered a tone. You and her. Me? You have to talk to her, Matteo. Now, before the doctor arrives, you have to get everything out of her, calmly, patiently, with all the love you have. We need to know how far that witch went. The beatings, insults, neglect, everything. Not for the lawsuit, but for her. So she gets it out, so she doesn't keep it inside and let it eat at her. It's the only way to start healing this. Matteo paled. The idea of sitting with his mother and making her relive every humiliation, every moment of terror seemed like torture as great as what she had suffered. I don't know if I can. You have to do it. Bobby's voice was soft but inflexible. You're her son. You're all she has. If you don't do it, who will? A psychologist? Later, yes. But now, it's you. She has to see that you don't break, that you can listen to her, that her truth doesn't destroy you, that will give her strength. Matteo nodded slowly. Bobby was right. Again, he always was in these things. Agreed, he whispered. I'll do it. Good. Bobby approached and put a firm hand on his shoulder. I'll call the doctor and pull strings to find Brenda. You go to her. I'll be around if you need me. Matteo left the study, feeling the weight of a monumental mission. The marble floor of the vestibule seemed interminable. Each step toward the living room was an effort. How was he going to ask her? Where to begin? Isabel still had her eyes closed, but wasn't sleeping. The dried tears had left bright furrows on her cheeks. Upon feeling his presence, she opened her eyes. She looked at him, and in that look, Matteo saw something new, not only pain and fear, but an abysmal shame, a humiliation that consumed her from within. He sat beside her, in the same place as before. He took her hand again. It wasn't so cold anymore. Mom, he began, and his voice sounded firmer than he expected. Bobby is here. He's going to take care of everything. That Brenda pays for what she did. Isabel nodded slightly, looking at the flames. I don't want problems, Matteo. It's over. There have to be problems, Mom, he said with gentleness, but firmness. She can't get away with it. Not after what she did to you, and not just today. The emphasis on that last phrase made Isabel look at him, alarmed, her eyes filled with panic again. What do you know? I found a notebook of Brenda's, and her phone, Matteo admitted, holding his breath. There were notes, videos. The sound that came from Isabel was a moan of pure agony. She tried to withdraw her hand, hide under the blankets. No. Oh God, no. You saw. I didn't see anything that made me think less of you, Mom, he interrupted, squeezing her hand so she wouldn't let go. Nothing. On the contrary, I saw how strong you've been, how much you've endured in silence. For me, so as not to bother me. Tears began to flow again down Isabel's face, silent, implacable. You were so busy, so important. My problems are nonsense. Old women's nonsense. They're not nonsense. Mateo's voice broke, and for the first time, tears appeared in his eyes, burning and unstoppable. It's you. You're the most important thing. I built all this for you, so you'd be safe, so you'd be cared for, and instead, I put a wolf in the house. I failed spectacularly. He dropped his head onto the blankets covering her, and a dry, heartbreaking sob shook his body. All control, cold fury, rage, crumbled in that instant, laying bare the terrified child who saw his mother suffer and could do nothing. He felt a weak, trembling hand settle on his hair, caressing it, as she did when he was little and had a nightmare. Son. No, Isabel whispered, her voice a thread of voice. You haven't failed. You worked. You gave me all this. She made a vague gesture with her other hand. How could you have known? She was so kind at first, so sweet, until one day she wasn't. Mateo raised his head, looking at her through a veil of tears. When did it start, Mom? Isabel closed her eyes, as if searching for the answer caused her physical pain. I don't know, after summer. It started with small things. She'd stopped putting the cream on my sores. She said it smelled bad. Then, she'd forget to give me the pain medication. She said it would damage my liver. She paused, swallowing. She spoke to me badly. She told me that I was a burden to you, that you were an important man, and I was a hindrance. Each word was a knife for Mateo. He listened, with his heart in pieces, without interrupting her. One day, she yelled at me because I fell, trying to get to the bathroom alone. She told me that if I was so useless, I should pee myself, and sometimes I did, out of fear. So as not to bother, her voice became an almost inaudible whisper. And then she'd clean me with contempt. She'd make the water very cold to liven me up. Like today. But today was the first time with the hose, because she got very angry when I called you this morning. Mateo frowned. You called me? Yes. Your secretary said you were in a very important meeting, that they couldn't bother you. I just wanted you to wish me good morning. Brenda heard. She got very angry. She said that old women like me shouldn't bother important men with nonsense. She said she was going to teach me a lesson so I'd learn. Mateo then remembered. His secretary had passed him a written message. Your mother called, says everything's fine. Just to say hello. He, immersed in profit charts, had smiled and kept the paper. He hadn't returned the call. That small gesture of connection his mother needed, had triggered Brenda's fury. He had ignored it. The guilt, enormous and suffocating, closed around his neck like a noose. I'm sorry, he groaned, burying his face in his hands. I'm sorry, Mom, I'm sorry. No, she insisted, with a strength that surprised him. It's not your fault. It's hers, only hers. Silence fell, broken only by Mateo's contained sobs and Isabel's labored breathing. She had broken the silence. She had named the monster, and although the pain was unbearable, something had changed. The secret no longer crushed, just the two of them. Was there more? Mateo finally asked, his voice hoarse. Beatings. Isabel hesitated. Then she nodded slowly. Sometimes, pinches, hard ones, where they couldn't be seen, on my arms under my nightgown. She raised her gaze, pleading, "But I don't want another doctor to see me, please." At that moment, Bobby poked his head through the living room door. "Dr. Evans is on his way. ETA 5 minutes. His gaze settled on Mateo, reading in his devastated face that the conversation had taken place. He nodded, almost imperceptibly, with approval. "Thanks, Bobby," Mateo said, wiping his tears with the back of his hand. "And the other matter?" In motion was the laconic response. "We have a location, a motel by the interstate. She's there, she won't move." A fierce and venomous relief flooded Mateo. She was located, trapped. Justice, or something like it, was on its way. The doorbell rang. Discreet. It was Dr. Evans. The next hour was a whirlwind of discreet professionalism. The doctor, a middle-aged man with calm manners and incipient baldness, examined Isabel on the sofa with the utmost delicacy possible. He documented the mild hypothermia, emotional shock, old and new bruises that Mateo hadn't seen, small violet ovals on the inside of her arms, and the open wound in her spirit. He spoke in low voices with Mateo, prescribed a mild sedative so she could sleep, and promised the complete medical report first thing in the morning. Finally, after Isabel accepted the sedative and finally fell asleep, a restless but deep sleep, the house fell into heavy silence. Bobby and Mateo remained in the study, with a whiskey now indeed necessary in their hands. "We have everything," Bobby said, breaking the silence. "The medical report is overwhelming. The evidence is irrefutable. I've spoken with Assistant Prosecutor Mitchell. He's shocked. He says with this, she gets all imaginable charges: assault, negligence, torture, elderly abuse. It's a sure sentence of more than 20 years. Mateo nodded. Looking at the amber liquid in his glass, he felt no triumph, only an enormous void. When Mitchell suggests waiting until dawn, send a couple of plainclothes agents to the motel, have her arrested without fuss. It's better for the case, less dramatic. Agreed. Mateo accepted. He could wait a few more hours. Knowing she was located, that she couldn't escape, gave him cold patience. Bobby finished his whiskey and stood up. "I'm staying in the guest room, in case something happens, or in case you need to talk." "Thank you, Bobby, for everything." "Don't thank me, boss. This is the only thing that can be done." Bobby left the study, leaving Mateo alone. Mateo remained there, sitting in the darkness, listening to his mother's deep and regular breathing coming from the living room. The house was silent, but no longer seemed sinister. The monster had been expelled, and now began the hardest part, living with the scars. He got up and went to her side. He sat on the floor, next to the sofa, and rested his head near hers. Closing his eyes for the first time in hours, he didn't see the image of ice water. He saw his mother, young, strong, laughing, working until late at night to pay for his studies. He saw her sacrificing everything for him, and he, in his obsession with giving her a golden old age, had forgotten the only thing she really needed: his presence, his attention, his time. Fortune, success, the house, everything was smoke. The only real thing was this woman, fragile and broken, who slept, thanks to a sedative, after having survived hell in silence. He took her hand, the one with perfectly manicured nails, the one that signed checks for millions, and intertwined it with his mother's hand, wrinkled, weak, marked by work and pain. "Never again," he whispered once more, a promise sealed in the twilight. "From now on, I take care of you." Dawn tinted the sky pale gray, when the sound of the main doorbell cut through the silence like a knife. Mateo, who hadn't slept a second, sat up from his chair with bloodshot eyes. Bobby, alert immediately, came out of the guest room, with his hand on the holster hidden under his sweatshirt. "The police? So early?" Matteo murmured, confused. Bobby peeked out the vestibule window. His expression froze. "No," he said, and his voice sounded strangely empty. "It's not the police." He opened the door cautiously. On the threshold, soaked and trembling with cold, her face decomposed in a grimace of absolute panic, stood Brenda. She didn't look like the cruel and confident woman from the evening before. She looked like a terrified ghost. "You have to help me," she screamed, her voice broken by fear and cold. "Please, they're going to kill me." Matteo and Bobby looked at each other, completely bewildered. Behind Brenda, on the snowy and deserted street, there was no one. She didn't seem to be fleeing from someone at that moment. "What are you talking about?" Matteo snapped, recovering his voice, rage returning in a hot torrent. "What game is this?" "It's not a game," Brenda pleaded, and real tears of pure terror flowed from her eyes. "It was him. It was all his idea. He forced me. He said that if I didn't do it, he'd—" "Who?" Bobby roared, grabbing her arm forcefully and dragging her inside to close the door. "Who forced you?" Brenda collapsed on the vestibule floor, sobbing uncontrollably. She raised her gaze to Matteo, and in her eyes there was no trace of the sadistic satisfaction from the day before. There was only visceral, primitive fear. It was your partner," she gasped, pointing at Matteo with a trembling finger. "Daniel Croft. He said that if he could make your mother, that if she got worse, that if you were too destroyed to take care of the company, he would take control, and he'd pay me a fortune. Everything was his idea." Matteo felt the ground open beneath his feet. Daniel Croft, his lifelong friend, his right hand, the architect of half his fortune. The revelation was so brutal, so monstrously unexpected, that it took the air from his lungs. It wasn't just the evil of a sick woman. It was a calculated, cold betrayal, coming from the heart of his own empire. Brenda, seeing the incredulity and horror plastered on his face, added the final thrust, her voice barely a thread of terrified sound. "And he told me that if they ever found out, he'd make sure I could never tell. Last night someone came to my motel room. They tried to kill me. I managed to escape. You're the only ones he fears. Please, protect me." Matteo leaned against the wall, dizzy. The nightmare hadn't ended. It had only changed form, becoming darker, deeper, and 1,000 times more dangerous. The resolution was as methodical and cold as the betrayal itself. Bobby, converted into the general of a silent war, orchestrated everything with millimetric precision. There were no dramatic confrontations or public accusations. There was evidence. Bobby used Brenda's terrified confession, recorded in audio and video, to confront Daniel Croft in his office, with 2 FBI agents present. There was no possible denial in the face of the digital evidence. Bobby had unearthed covered bank transfers to Brenda, encrypted emails with sinister instructions about the deterioration of Isabel's health, and the testimony of a private investigator on Croft's payroll, who had been sent to the motel to silence Brenda forever. Daniel Croft's fall was swift and thunderous. He was arrested for conspiracy, attempted murder, coercion, and abuse of a vulnerable person. His empire of lies crumbled in hours, forever staining his name and freeing Matteo from the snake that had been coiled in his own home. Brenda, in exchange for her crucial testimony against Croft, accepted a plea agreement. There was no mercy in Matteo's heart, but there was justice. She was sentenced to a long prison term, in an institution where her cruelty would have no room to cause harm. Justice, at last, had been served cold. But the real battle, Matteo knew, wasn't fought in the courts. It was fought in his house's living room, in the quiet of mornings, in silences that were no longer filled with fear, but with slow and painful reconstruction. Isabel woke from the sedative's lethargy in a different house. The shadow of Brenda and Croft's betrayal had dissipated. Mateo, fulfilling his promise, had dismantled his penthouse office and moved it to a room adjacent to the living room. His video calls with Singapore and Zoom meetings now had as background his mother's serene face, reading or looking out the window. He hired a new caregiver, an older and quiet woman named Clara, whose only mission was accompaniment and company, not 24-hour care, because that was now Mateo's task. He prepared her breakfast, read her the newspaper, helped her walk a few steps through the garden. When the sun warmed enough, he learned to administer her medication, to understand her silences, to distinguish physical pain from momentary sadness. It was slow learning, full of stumbles and moments of overwhelming tenderness. Isabel's nightmares gradually diminished, replaced by the security of knowing her son was there, present, not as the powerful magnate, but as the child she once calmed after a nightmare. One afternoon, several months later, spring was timidly appearing in the garden. Isabel was sitting in her armchair, a light blanket over her legs. Mateo was on the sofa, reviewing some documents. "Son," she said suddenly, her voice clearer than it had been in a long time. Mateo immediately looked up. "Yes, Mom? Do you need anything?" "No." She smiled, a small but genuine smile that lit up her eyes. "I just wanted to tell you that today I remembered when you were 7 years old and fell from the swing. You broke your arm." Mateo frowned, surprised by the memory. "Yes, it was horrible. I screamed like a demon. And Isabel continued, her gaze lost in the past. "I hugged you so tight and ran with you to the hospital, not caring about anything else. Just you. Your pain was my pain." Mateo remained still, holding his breath. "These months," she whispered, her voice charged with emotion, "I've felt that you were finally returning the hug, that my pain was your pain. And it doesn't hurt so much anymore." Mateo stood up, crossed the room, and knelt in front of her, taking her hands in his. He said nothing. Words weren't needed. Forgiveness, guilt, love, and redemption intertwined in that silence, healing the deepest wounds. Mateo Cruz's empire hadn't suffered. On the contrary, it had found a new balance. He delegated more to trusted people, discovering that the world didn't end if he wasn't present 24 hours. His wealth was no longer just a figure in a bank. It was the time he now had. It was the privilege of witnessing the slow flowering of peace in his mother's eyes. One afternoon, walking with her through the garden, now without snow, with the first flowers appearing, Isabel stopped and squeezed his arm. "I'm tired, son. Can we sit for a while?" "Of course, Mom. All the time in the world." He helped her sit on a wooden bench under an old oak. The afternoon sun filtered through the branches, painting golden patterns over them. Isabel closed her eyes, tilting her face toward the warmth. "You know," she said, almost to herself, "after winter, spring always comes." Mateo looked at her, at his mother, the woman who had saved him from darkness without knowing it, simply by allowing him to care for her. And he knew, with a certainty that filled his chest with deep calm, that finally all loose ends were tied. Evil had been expelled, justice had been served, and love, that quiet and resistant love that had survived the cruelest winter, had bloomed again, stronger and truer than ever. He took his mother's hand and remained there, sitting beside her, watching the garden that was being reborn, at peace, finally, at peace.